Now we take a look at one of the most unique social and cultural systems in the history of the world, and that's the caste system. To understand the caste system, you have to understand Hinduism, so we'll be looking at that as well. Finally, we'll look at Buddhism, which emerges during this time in India and challenges Hinduism and the caste system. As mentioned in the previous video, the caste system emerged as the Aryans migrated or invaded India in the centuries after the Harappan civilization collapsed. It was apparently the way in which the natives and newcomers organized themselves, with the Aryans having power generally. What comes of this is a very strict social hierarchy unique to the world. First, we have the Brahmins. Let's get these words up here for you. And they are the priests. They're at the top due to their spiritual connection. Right below them are the Kshatriya. And they are the warriors and aristocrats. Aristocrats being the landowners. And of course, we know landowners, ownership means wealth, power, and status. Then comes the Vaishya. These are the merchants and peasants of Indian civilization. Finally come the Shudra. These are the serfs, people who are tied to the land, and then eventually an unofficial group called the Untouchables emerge. These are folks nobody literally want to touch, because while a person is not able to move up in caste, they can certainly move down. And it was thought that by touching such a person, you could lose caste. The caste system is so stringent, it doesn't allow intermarrying among castes. As you can imagine, a very patriarchal society emerges out of this. Women are encouraged to remain in the private sphere, and children or child marriage was a common thing. You had girls as young as 8 marrying men in their 20s, and of course these were typically arranged marriages. The caste system goes just beyond a few categories, as economics play a role in diversifying Indian social structure. Jatis were formed as a sort of subcaste. These guilds were based on your profession typically and could offer upward mobility within your caste. So even within your caste, you had the opportunity to improve yourself. You just could never jump up to the next caste. Now, of course, Hinduism is going to tie into that with the idea of reincarnation, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. An early challenge to the caste system, however, came in the form of Jainism, which practices a principle of extreme non-violence. It's so demanding that really only devout monks could observe it closely and properly. They practiced something called ahimsa, which means they swept the earth in front of them. They would strain the water before using it or drinking it, and they used slow movements to try and prevent killing insects. So it wasn't a practical thing for an average person, and that's why it never really became a mass movement. But it did appeal to the poor because it did not recognize jati. Early Buddhism is founded in the 5th century BCE by Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince who lived a sheltered life until he was in his late 20s. He finally left his palace for the first time and discovered, shockingly to him, people who were old, people who were sick, and then finally people who were dead. And so, in recognizing suffering for the first time, he decides to become a monk, and he wanders around in search of enlightenment. And he does this by meditating and practicing a lifestyle that we would call Spartan, not indulging in anything extreme, basically living a very simple life. And so, allegedly, after 49 days of meditation under a tree, during which time he supposedly sustained himself on the dew from leaves, he found enlightenment, and he takes the title of Buddha, which means the enlightened one. About 528 BCE, he begins teaching his new doctrine, which I'll discuss briefly in a minute. His followers, they only owned robes and a food bowl, which was known as a begging bowl. And so their lives were that of just wandering around, meditating, and begging for their meals. Eventually, they grow enough that they're able to establish monastic communities to help Buddhism grow. What is Buddhism about? Well, the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering, but there is an end to the suffering. The way to end the suffering is to remove all desires. And to remove desire, you do so through the Eightfold Path. And basically, right views, intention, speech, livelihood, etc. All of these things, if you do them on a daily basis, you will not have suffering, and you will not have desire, and therefore you will not have suffering. So, because Buddhism did not appeal to, or did not depend on the Brahmins for ritual activities and religious rites, it was appealing to a larger group of people. Buddhism also did not recognize caste or the jati status. So what this does is, if I'm a poor person, I'm a low caste person, I'm certainly looking at Buddhism as something positive and as an alternative to Hinduism. It was something called the Middle Path, which is basically the philosophy of moderate consumption. Yeah, it's okay to have things. Not everybody had to live the extreme life that Buddha and his followers lived, but if you wanted to live the right life, be modest and consume things moderately. Don't be greedy, etc. The best thing a person could do is to teach others these things, and that was the greatest public service. And another reason Buddhism was able to get a pretty strong following was because the teachings were written down in the vernacular, not Sanskrit, which was the language of the region, but not many people could read it. So your local language that you could actually read is what Buddhism was put down into, and so that made it pretty appealing to a lot of people. Another thing to help the spread of Buddhism was Ashoka, who we talked about in the last video. He ends up converting to Buddhism after he was allegedly disillusioned with the violence of war when he destroyed the kingdom of Kalinga. And he adheres to the principle of ahimsa, which we see with the Jains. So he bans animal sacrifices. He mandated that vegetarianism be practiced at court. And then he gave material support for Buddhist institutions and monasteries. Missionary activity was encouraged by the government. Although we're going to see that Ashoka maybe didn't exactly convert to Buddhism for the reasons that most historians tell. Buddhism begins to spread, and because it involves a pretty tremendous amount of sacrifice, giving up personal property, for example, forsaking the search for social standing, detaching oneself from the charms of family and the world, and the idea that it takes thousands of reincarnations to escape this cycle of being reborn. Buddhism begins to adapt as it moves, and different regions decide to make Buddhism a little bit different. We see this with a lot of religions, of course. So some new developments that happen as Buddhism spreads, and we call this Mahayana Buddhism, is the reduction in obligations for the believers. So they don't have to live quite as a hardcore lifestyle as the original Buddhists. And this helps Buddhism gain popularity as it spreads across Asia. We also see a change in the Buddha from being just a teacher and philosopher to actually becoming a divine figure. And so this was what makes Buddhism definitely a religion as opposed to a philosophy. And then we have bodhisattvas. These are people who had reached what we would call spiritual perfection, but delayed entering nirvana so that they could go about helping others to reach theirs. So it was like the ultimate sacrifice. And then Buddhist monasteries go from being like these places where they have nothing to actually accepting gifts from wealthy individuals in exchange for salvation. So we see a little bit of what we might call corruption within Buddhism as it begins to spread around. Certainly the Buddhism that is practiced in China during this time is nothing that Siddhartha Gautama would have recognized. So Buddhism begins to become popular. Well, what does this do to Hinduism? Well, Hinduism is an adaptable religion as well. It's going to slowly replace Buddhism altogether and just make Buddha one of their gods. Remember, Hinduism is a polytheistic religion, and because it's so tightly tied to the caste system, it's never going to be pushed out totally. So Buddhism is not a religion of missionaries, and because of that, they're not out trying to convert people. It just happens to naturally spread and people convert to it. So the people of India end up, giving up on Buddhism to the point that it's almost extinguished entirely within the subcontinent. So it eventually makes a comeback. The Bhagavad Gita was a short poem around the year 400 BCE, or the 400 CE, that taught people of, Hinduism's idea of your duty is to perform whatever your caste has you to do. So if you're a warrior, you're meant to be a warrior. And that's spiritually important to them. And so that really helps Hinduism regain its status because it ties itself even closer into the caste system. As for what the caste system tells you to do, well, we have certain things. We have an emphasis on meeting your obligations. And so what we have here is something called dharma. I'll put these words in for you. Your obligations for your caste system. So again, like I mentioned, if you're supposed to be a Brahmin, that's what you should be. You should not be something else, no matter what your interests are. There's the idea of pursuit of economic well-being and honesty, as long as you're being honest about how you go about it. Artha. Enjoyment of social, physical, and sexual pleasure. So these people are not prudes. This is kama, not karma, kama. And finally, salvation of the soul, getting released from being reborn continually. And eventually, if you live the perfect lifestyle, you will be released from reincarnation and be one, and you have reached nirvana. So the idea here is, if you live a wrong lifestyle, you're going to be reborn as something that is not desirable. If you live the right way, you're going to be reborn better off in the next life. And so this certainly ties into how Hindus behave and how they go about living their lives. And that's going to be something we see not just in classical India, but it's going to remain no matter who rules India, no matter what religion they bring with them. This is going to be something that India has with it until even the present day. The crash course video on India that you'll be watching here soon really goes into great detail on the caste system. So if you still have questions about that, I think John Green does a good job of answering a lot of those key questions. Our next lesson on India is going to deal with the economic network of classical India. It'll be a short lesson. It ties into the Silk and Sea Roads and helps us to understand India's history a little more.